Good evening. You know how sometimes you don't know if you should say something or you shouldn't say something? And you really feel like you shouldn't say something, but then you do, and then you regret it? That's about to happen to me, so I thought I'd just tell you in advance, because I think the point was something about shaking our tails or something. If we're happy, I'm not sure what you got out of it, but anyway, I know I'm going to regret saying that, but Mike, bleep that out of the streaming. Sorry, sometimes, you know. Okay, all silliness aside here. Sunday I was talking about traveling back to Indiana, which we did quite frequently when I was a little kid, starting out on Route 66. It was one of those roads I knew really, really well over the years because we traveled a lot. And I'm wondering, is there some road that you have traveled so frequently that you kind of know everything along the way? And it doesn't have to be some big interstate. It may be a very short, contained route that you take from one place to another, but some road where you kind of know everything along the way. John?
In Arkansas, it was about 30 minutes from my house to town, basically, to everything, school, the church building, everything. So that 30-minute drive back, you get to know it so well, and it got to the point where you would drive it, and then you'd be pulling into the driveway of the house, not remembering anything. Okay. And I actually heard that's actually a common phenomenon, and it's called like hypnotism. You're actually being hypnotized by the lines on the road. That's what I read somewhere, and I guess if you know the street really well, and your mind is dull, it's kind of like the spin wheel or something in your eyes. The lines of the road hypnotize you so that you kind of forget.
All right. I think we've all had that happen. So that road from town to the house, back and forth, many times a week. Tim?
Well, does it count if your car just goes to where it's going? I think that's the same thing. From my house to the Newland Street building, my car would just go. Even if I'm not going to the Newland Street, it's going there. I go, what did I get off here for? So, no.
Church building? Anybody? Yes.
Mine was the same thing, Route 66. But then, when I-40 come along, between here and Albuquerque, they cut off 100 miles.
Okay. Betty's pointing out, perfect segue. Betty mentions Route 66, and along Route 66, you knew everything. I remember when Elle and I were dating, driving up to the Central Valley over and over and over and over again. I knew every exit off the 99. I could just scream, I knew them all back then. But then, all of a sudden maybe, and so maybe you don't, everything always looks the same, but then you see something different, something new happens. Interstate 40 comes in, and of course you save the 100 miles and you can go a lot faster. And now when you drive Interstate 40, every once in a while you look over and you see all those places that have ceased to exist because they've been bypassed by the interstate, and all the little towns that are gone. But that happens, that sometimes you're on a road and you do it so often that you don't even see anything. I mean, you know it so well that you don't pick up on anything. And then every once in a while, you'll be driving along on that road and you'll see something that you've never noticed before. Has that ever happened to you? Where all of a sudden you see something and it's like, wow, that's been there all the time? And if you've ever had that kind of thing happen, Mike?
Well, we used to drive from the San Joaquin Valley down here. And we always remember the orange sky and the smog. And then one day we were driving, this is 30, 40 years later, we're driving back to the valley from here, and I noticed over there around Dodger Stadium, there's hills. And that's the first time I ever realized there's a bunch of houses up there, because you couldn't see them before.
It was smog away and you could see the hills around Dodger Stadium. We had some friends that we knew in Petaluma who had lived down in the Ontario area for a while, and when they moved down here, and this was in the really terrible days of smog, When they moved down, it was in the summer. The smog was horrible. And they lived there for like 4 months. And then all of a sudden one day there wasn't smog, and they saw the mountains were like, 10 miles away. And they'd never seen them. So sometimes that happens. You'll drive along and it's like, well, how long has that place been there? Well, and so you kind of appreciate something new. Well, the reason I mention that is because we're on really familiar ground in Mark 14. We're looking at a story that we have gone over and over and over, many of us, most of our lives. We've read the Passion of Jesus in all of the Gospels. Most of us could right now tell with most of the details this story. And so what happens, John used that example of kind of you get hypnotized. It's like, yeah, I've read this before. I know what's going to happen. There's going to be the denial. There's going to be this. And of course, that's just, we know it that well, so that's going to be a part of what we see as we go through this. But what I'd like to encourage us to do is to just keep our eyes open, maybe for that one thing that we hadn't seen before. Maybe something that pops out at us that we hadn't noticed before. And if that happens to you, let me know. That's to me always the challenge of studying and then especially teaching a text that may be quite familiar to a lot of people. And so we pick up the story where John left off. We're in Mark chapter 14, and we're going to be looking at Jesus in Gethsemane. If you have open up your Bible, and in Mark 14, John mentioned last week what we've talked about on a couple of occasions, how Mark likes to bookend different events. He'll have events on either side of something in the middle, and the organizing, the arranging of it in that way is calling some special attention to it. And he pointed this out, and we're kind of picking up on the other side of it tonight. So I'd like for us to kind of be reminded. Looking in chapter 14, verses 17 to 21, you can just glance at that. And in a sentence, what is that paragraph about? Chapter 14, verses 17 to 21. A sentence or a phrase?
The betrayal. Yeah, the betrayal.
Jesus foretells the betrayal. Okay, go down to verses 27 to 31, and what do we hear? Do the same kind of summary on that paragraph. They're going to fall away. There's going to be a denial. There's going to be a fall away. There'll be a falling away. Both of these, Jesus is foretelling something that's going to happen. First, the betrayal, then the offense, and the fleeing, the running away. What story's in the middle? The Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper's in the middle. And, I mean, there's a lot of things that, if you think about that, your mind may pick up on different things than what I'm about to say. But what strikes me is that you have these two stories of betrayal, two stories of disciples falling short of what they ought to be. And the center story is about Jesus, who's giving his life and giving his all and making a total commitment to save not only these disciples, but all of us. There may be other contrasts or comparisons you pick up on, but I do think that it's sometimes helpful to kind of see that. And Mark does that a lot. We probably, as we read through Mark without even thinking of it, draw certain conclusions based on the arrangement and maybe haven't even really consciously thought of how that came about. Now what happens here also? We left off at verse 26. Your Bible may make that the new paragraph, but we're putting that with the last paragraph. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Now, if you just skip from there to verse 32, it fits perfectly. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives, and they went to a place called Gethsemane. And do you see how that just perfectly flows? This little paragraph, there's a sense in which it's inserted or it doesn't fit. I'm not suggesting it's not Mark. I'm not suggesting it's not Scripture, but I am saying it doesn't go with the flow. It's inserted there, and I'm wondering if anybody might have an idea of why, or any thought about the placement of it there. Or maybe you're thinking about, well, where is this in the other Gospels? Let me just ask you. Thinking back to the other Gospels, when does Jesus talk about Peter denying him? Where are they? Do you remember? Do you recall? Yeah, they're at the table. They're in the upper room. Here, do you notice that the setting is kind of ambiguous? Where are they in verse 27? Are they still upstairs? Are they on the road? Are they at the garden? Mark doesn't really give us any markers. And I don't want to make too big of a deal out of this, but the other writers place this within the upper room story. Mark does not. And I would suggest that perhaps one of the reasons that he does that is because of the way he bookends the story in between. He doesn't tell the story, he doesn't go from betrayal to denial to the Lord's Supper. He uses it as a bookend. And what we're going to find out tonight in just a minute, if I don't take up too much of your time on other things, is that this serves as kind of a double bookend. This is going to bookend with something that comes later in just a moment. And I think as you look at the placement of where Mark puts this, it has that kind of effect of becoming a reflection of two other stories on either side of it that have stories about Jesus in the middle. And you'll see that in just a minute. The story that follows the foretelling of denial is Jesus praying in the garden. Does that seem to parallel? You think of Jesus praying in the garden, Jesus giving the Last Supper. And we'll see how there are going to be three stories on either side of that and one in the middle that contrast the disciples. And I know that seems kind of technical and like, well, yeah, but let's just read the story. And I can understand that. But I think it helps us to understand that when Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John write their Gospels, they are quite purposeful about the way they do it. These are not haphazard documents. They're well thought out. And we've talked in classes before that Gospel writers, they're not just telling a chronological story. They choose and select certain material that they will include in their Gospel. They discard other material that they will not include in their Gospel. They may put them in different orders because they're trying to make a different point. They will put in different details or leave them out or tell a long version while somebody else tells a short version because of the particular purpose that each writer has. And so the very construction of a gospel can really help us get to the point of what the gospel writer is trying to say. And I think that'll come out here. If it's a little fuzzy or foggy right now, hopefully it'll come out in just a moment. But I think it's a good example of how Mark selects his material and then shapes it to make the points that he wants to make about, in this case, the commitment of Jesus and the struggle that disciples have to follow. So let's take a look. Verses 27 to 31. And Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." Peter said to him, "Even though they all fall away, I will not." And Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he said emphatically, "If I must die with you, I will not deny you." And they all said the same. Well, just as in reading this, what does Jesus know? I mean, just generally speaking, what does Jesus know as he talks to his apostles? He knows what they're going to do. He knows what's going to happen. It is all before him. Jesus is thoroughly aware of the events that are about to transpire. And just a quick overview, what stands out? What does he say is going to happen?
They're all going to fall away,
Mm-hmm.
and they're going to all deny it.
They're going to fall away, and there's going to be a denial. Yes. Don't lose, we'll come back to this in a moment, but Jesus also says resurrection. And it's amazing as we go through this that the apostles don't even seem to pick up on that. And I think, as I read through it, it's like, I'm not sure I really pick up on it. I mean, if I really stop and somebody says, okay, what else is there? Like we just did. But when I read through, what comes to mind? Oh, this is the denial of Peter. And it's amazing how all that Jesus says there. And Jesus quotes a passage. What passage does he quote? Or what, you may not know the text, but can you see the quotation marks? What's the passage there? Yeah, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. It's a quotation from Zechariah chapter 13, verse 7. It's kind of a proverbial statement, isn't it? If you strike the shepherd, what are the sheep going to do? They're going to scatter. They got no leader. They're going to go. It's really, out of Zechariah, it's essentially a proverbial statement. And in the context of Zechariah, what's going on is there is, in the vision that Zechariah is having, a shepherd standing next to God, who God commands be struck down, that the sheep might be scattered. This is in Zechariah, this is part of a refining process that's going to lead to the redemption of God's people. And we're told in chapter 13, verse 1 of Zechariah, that this is for the cleansing, or this is to open up a fountain for the cleansing of sin on behalf of the house of David in Jerusalem. I'm not saying that Jesus quoting Zechariah 13 is pointing to the fact that the primary fulfillment of Zechariah is this moment, but it's interesting that Jesus quotes a passage that has to do with redemption and cleansing and the refining of Israel, and God purposefully striking a shepherd, his shepherd, in order to make that happen. Because all of those themes fit with what's about to happen with Jesus going to the cross. It is God who sends Jesus to the cross. We realize this is not something happening outside of God's will. And so Jesus is really making use of all of those themes out of that prophecy in Zechariah. And how does Peter respond to that? Yes. Yeah, he's not going to. And even if I have to die with you, that I will not deny you. He's emphatic about that. And it's almost as if we find the disciples here a bit offended by the statement. This causes an offense to them. And that's what Peter seems to seize on as he talks to Jesus. And why do you think that both he and the disciples are so sure of themselves?
Because notice it's not just Peter.
The emphasis is on Peter, and Peter's the first to speak up. Why do you think that they are so certain that this will not happen?
John?
I think they've given their lives to Jesus. You can't question what they're willing to sacrifice. And they faced down dangerous times before with Jesus by their side. I think what Peter and the others just don't understand is that things will look a lot different when Jesus is, suddenly not fighting back, suddenly not showing his power in the traditional sense.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's right on. Yes, Ellen.
I was just thinking too that they still don't understand that they're not going to be an earthly kingdom, and I think they are ready to fight for that and to die for that. Jesus says he's going to be raised up. They don't even question that. I mean, that it just goes right over their head.
An earthly kingdom, and they're ready to fight for that. And I think Peter will demonstrate before the night's over. I thought Mark, I believe, does not name him, that he is willing to do that. Tim?
He is the Messiah. He is the Son of God. and they know it, how can they fail?
Exactly. I think
Exactly how they're thinking. No, we're not leaving you now. We're here. We're going to stand with you, no matter what. And it's interesting, there's been a bit of a development with Peter, because earlier back in chapter 8, remember, there's not going to be any suffering going on. There's not going to be anything bad happening here. And now he's actually making a commitment to stand with Jesus in the midst of that. However, when you hear him say that, what do you think in Peter's mind? What do you think he's really saying that he's going to be willing to do? What is he thinking about when he says, if I have to die with you, I will not deny you? What is he conjuring up in his mind as a possibility against which he's stating emphatically that he'll not deny Jesus?
Yeah, an epic battle.
And he's ready. And I think he's making that commitment, and he is absolutely certain if it comes to that, he'll pull out that sword, he will stand his ground, and if it means he gets chopped down, then so be it. He will die right next to Jesus, and he's ready to do that. And John pointed out earlier, what he doesn't understand, what the apostles don't understand, is what's going to happen. They have no idea how this is going to transpire. And so that's what's going to catch them by surprise. And Jesus, of course, as we move through this text, knows exactly that's the very thing that is going to catch them by surprise. It is somewhat interesting here that Peter kind of doubles down. He essentially says, maybe them, but not me. And I just wonder how that went over, but it doesn't say. But it's like, they may do it, but not me. You can count on me. I'm going to stand with you for the duration. Another contrast here, go back to the upper room and the table, go back to verses 17 to 21. What's their response when Jesus brings up this idea of betrayal? How do they respond to that?
Yeah.
They all ask if it's them.
Exactly.
They're wondering, is it me? Is it me? Is it me? They're almost like uncertain. Could it and here they are. It's an interesting change, because just a few moments ago, they didn't know if they might betray Jesus or not. And here they are swearing loyalty to him. And again, it comes back to not knowing at all what it is that's about to happen. And their pride here, their arrogance, and especially Peter, who kind of doubles down, will heighten the completeness of their failure at the critical moment that's about to come upon them. And this is where I just want to come back to a minute about Galilee. What does Jesus say about Galilee?
Yes, he'll go ahead of them in Galilee.
And when is this going to be? After he's raised up. They'll see him again. How do they miss that? Does that not seem like a pretty big thing to just not see? They seem so fastened on this idea of denial. And if you think back to the other predictions of Jesus' passion, going back to chapter 8, around verse 30, 31, when Jesus tells them, we're going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to be handed over to the chief priest, I'm going to be put to death, and I'll rise on he tells them then. Every time he tells them about his death, he speaks of his resurrection, and somehow, for whatever reason, I would just say their kind of spiritual dullness, that just seems to get past them. They seize on this talk of death. They seize on this talk of denial, and they miss what is pretty much a full-out declaration of Jesus that he's going to conquer death, that he's going to be victorious over death, and what and what that is going to mean for them when they regroup in a sense.
Sometimes seen this in many other places that, I mean, they were so put back about, one of you is going to betray me, but when I get raised, I'll go before you, Callie. They're so stuck, and there's been times when they don't understand what he's saying. Well, I don't understand that part. I'm just going to skip to the part that I understand. And it's happened many times where they don't understand. Well, okay, we'll just skip it. You know? I don't know what that means.
Yeah,
They skip it and they fasten on to something else. And yeah.
It's easy for us to do the same. When we read through this, that is that. And it happened just a moment ago. Well, it's betrayed, and then but we missed it.
yeah.
And the word go before, it can just simply mean I'll get there first. That may just be all it means. I'll get to Galilee and then you'll come and join me. But in the language here of shepherd and sheep, I think it's just, I mean, you can just kind of see it as also speaking of he'll go before them again. He'll be the shepherd again. He'll go out in front of his flock again. There'll be a reconstitution and a regathering of all of them up in Galilee, and Jesus will go before them. Although technically the word simply means to precede, but I think in the context here of speaking about shepherds and sheep, it's just something to take a look at. And then of course we have the just straightforward prophecy of Jesus that Peter will deny him 3 times. And that's just done quite clearly. Three denials, which has a way of just saying, you will thoroughly deny me. Now, of course, it will literally be 3 denials. But the fact that it's a threefold denial is an indication that this will be a complete, thorough denunciation and dissociation of Jesus. They will not want to be associated with the shepherd when he gets struck down. When the shepherd gets struck down, they're not going to want to be associated with him. They will then be offended at him because of what's happening to him, and that's what will cause them ultimately to flee. And it's interesting, isn't it, that Peter is so adamant, he is so vehement in making this declaration, and before this chapter is over, with the same vehemence and in emphatic language, he will say, I do not know that man. It's just amazing how quickly that very certain emphatic language, on one hand, is to declare that he could never deny him. He'll use that same kind of language in just a few hours to deny that he even knows who Jesus is. And of course, that's the great fall that Peter undergoes here. As we continue to read, they're at some point along here, they're leaving the city of Jerusalem. Depending where the upper room is in the city, they're probably going anywhere from a 20 to 35 minute walk, maybe a good half hour, depending where the house is. They come out the gate of the city, they walk across the Kidron Valley, which is to the east, and then they start up the Mount of Olives, which is just on the east side of the city. Everything is pretty compact there. If you've seen pictures of it or been there, you know it's all very close. And as they get there, going up the Mount of Olives, they come to a garden that's called Gethsemane, which means oil press, which points to probably an olive grove there, and on the Mount of Olives, maybe a gated, enclosed type of place. John, I know we're in Mark, John mentions that they enter the garden. So it may be, people have speculated that it may have been a private area, oil press and little olive orchard owned by someone that they knew, because it does appear to be a place that they went frequently, because as we know, Judas knows where they are. When he comes, Judas knows where they're going to be. And so they come to this place, and now these very, very familiar events unfold at verse 32. Let's go ahead and read. And they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And he took with him Peter and James and John, and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. remain here and watch. And going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. As we enter this particular section, we're going to begin to see how this bookend will reappear, because we have the foretelling of denial and fleeing. Now we'll have Jesus in the garden facing his own struggles, and what will follow will be the fleeing of the apostles. And so again, what is happening here is quite a contrast to what's happening with them. And it helps us understand, and there will be other things that happen here, that Jesus faces this struggle alone. Not apart from the Father, but other than the Father, Jesus faces a struggle alone. We've all faced struggles. We've all faced horrible moments in our life. And maybe you face something in your life completely alone. I hope not. But here, there's nobody talking to him. There's nobody to stand with him. There's nobody to understand. The people who are closest to him are not available. And honestly, he doesn't seem to be expecting it. He doesn't seem to be looking to the apostles to somehow come to his aid and to his encouragement, at least in the way that I see the text. And we can talk more about that as we go on. Who does Jesus take with him a little further than the rest of the group? Peter, James, and John. And why? Why do you think he takes Peter, James, and John a little bit further? Okay, we see them as the inner circle. They have appeared as a kind of a little subgroup of the apostles on at least two occasions. Mark chapter 5 at the home of Jairus, when Jesus goes in to raise up Jairus' daughter, he takes Peter, James, and John. The other time is Peter, James, and John and Jesus where? Transfiguration. Yeah, they're there and now here. Any other reason that Peter, James, and John might be the ones that get special treatment? You think of anything else in how they've interacted with Jesus up to this point about what's about to happen? Peter's probably kind of obvious because it's just happened. Peter has just made a pretty strong declaration of who he is and what he's going to do and how he's going to handle himself. And if we go back a couple of chapters, you may recall James and John being asked a question by Jesus. Are you able to be baptized with the baptism that I'm going to undergo? Are you able to drink the cup that I'm going to drink? Oh, sure. We got this. We can do it. We can handle it. They're also, I think, the inner circle. They are the inner circle, and that may be why they respond the way they do. But all three of those share this in common, that they have shown pretty clearly to Jesus that they have no idea about what his passion's really all about. And they see it as some way, perhaps, for them to gain power position. As Ellen said, if they're thinking of the kingdom being an earthly kingdom. And so Jesus calls them and has some special words for them. What does he tell them to do? Okay. He says, okay, yeah, depending on your translation, mine says remain here and watch. That word watch is a pretty, I think it's a word that's quite filled with meaning. It's about being alert. It's about thinking. It's about taking stock of what's happening right now and making some kind of sense out of it. And so he calls upon them to do. What does he say about himself? his soul is very sorrowful. And then he says, even to death. His sorrow overwhelms him to the point, the way I think that phrase is what it's meant to be, it's like essentially saying that it's like sorrow is so oppressive, it's like it could kill him. The sorrow is so great, it's so troubling. This is such an overwhelming moment for him that it's pressing that hard upon him and upon his life. And he calls them in that spirit to watch. They have just declared their loyalty, and I think what Jesus is trying to get them to understand, which of course they don't, is that this crisis is their defining moment. The next couple of hours, depending how long this scene takes to unfold, this is the defining moment for these three men. Until after the resurrection, this will be the moment that defines them. And Jesus knows it will. And Jesus knows the impact that's going to have on them after these events unfold. And so he is calling upon them to be watchful. And then he asked the Father to remove, oh, yes.
Do you think in any way that he is, because of his deep sorrowfulness, that he is needing, in a human way, their moral support as he goes and he communicates with God, and needing them to watch? He doesn't want the soldiers to come before he's finished praying even, or if it...
Ellen is saying, is it possible that Jesus is needing them as a human being for support, for moral, for encouragement, and could the watching have to do with maybe the coming of the soldiers coming too soon, which is that could be a possibility. A couple of things come to my mind. Later he will be more specific in just a moment about what the watching is about. The watching is about temptation, and yeah, it's not just a. So I think Jesus will define it a little bit more clearly. And I guess just the way that what you're saying, maybe could Jesus use the encouragement? Absolutely. Jesus is a man as well as divine, and certainly having men who understood him, who were there with him, who were supporting him, would be a great blessing. But I think Jesus knows they're not there.
later.
Yes, and the question will be,
What is it? Is he going there for encouragement? And let's hold off on that because we'll get there, and that may be. We can read this and maybe come to different conclusions about it, but we'll take a look at that in just a second. Jesus has been so focused on going to the cross. He's spoken of it. He set his face to Jerusalem with such determination that it caused the apostles to be afraid. What's happening now? Why now is the prayer that it be taken away? There has been no wavering. Is Jesus has he lost his resolve? Is he wavering in God's will? Of course, the answer to that's no. So we don't. That's not the answer. I don't think. I don't think there's any wavering in Jesus. But what's happening here? What do you think's happening in the garden with the prayer? What is it as Jesus faces, as he faces this moment that causes him to ask for this from God? What is he looking at that's about to transpire that would cause him to ask such a question?
This might not be where you're going.
well, hey, it's open because
Is a man.
Mhm.
It's getting close. Just getting close. We know how it can be. We know we're going to do this, and it's getting close, and it's something big. And as it gets closer and closer, you can become more nervous or anxious about an event that's about to transpire. It seems to me as a man, he could do this, and he knows what's going to happen. If at all possible, God, please take this away, but not my will, yours.
Yes.
Yeah, And I think that's there. There's a sense in which you can look at that, at the story as you just have, and say, he's been talking about this, but now it's immediate, and there's a certain intensity to what's about to transpire. And though we're not, well, let me ask if anybody else has something to add to that. Mike?
Well, I was thinking that like a lot of people that are facing that time in their life where they're going to die, their concern many times is not for themselves, but those that they're leaving behind.
Okay.
Some concern may be for somebody that's being left behind.
Prepared for that.
Okay, yes,
And Jesus knows that the apostles are not particularly prepared at that particular point in time. You know, I think something else that and it's not addressed in the text, I think we would just have to look at the greater story to make this point, is that Jesus going to the cross, beyond what's happening to him physically and beyond the physical death, is the moment when he becomes the bearer of sin of all time, where Paul will say in 2 Corinthians 5 that God will make him who knew no sin to be sin. The writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews 2:9 that Jesus tastes death for every man. And since we all die anyway, I think in Hebrews what he's talking about is that Jesus tastes that alienation from God on our behalf that we do not taste when he goes to the cross. We jump ahead to the God-forsaken cry, my God, why have you forsaken me? And we think of him bearing all of the sins of the world in his body on the tree. And there is a horror to that when you think of the complete unity of the Father and the Son for eternity. And sin is about to destroy that, and Jesus is about to endure that alienation from the Father, which I think is probably something beyond our ability to understand completely. And he uses that word cup, and there's a couple of places in the Old Testament where we read about that. One's in Isaiah chapter 51, verse 17, where Israel is given the cup of God's wrath and drinks it down to the dregs, and it's the cup that brings punishment and wrath. And sometimes when we think of Jesus drinking the cup, we think of him drinking a cup that we should drink, that he's drinking the cup of wrath that is God's wrath for sin. It's interesting in the passage in Isaiah 51 that God then removes the cup from Israel. This talk about removing the cup. God is giving the cup to Israel, but then he removes the cup from Israel and gives the cup to Israel's enemies. It may be in kind of that sort of context, or in that kind of an image that Jesus is thinking, is there a way for the cup to be removed from me? You removed the cup from Israel. Is there a way to proceed and remove the cup that I'm about to drink? If it, essentially, if it is to be understood as the wrath of God for sin. And so he raises the possibility, he seeks that in a sense. Let's just say, maybe a way of putting it is, he explores the limits of God's will. And he does not push beyond the limits of God's will. As Tim said, not my will. He says, not my will, but the Father's will. He knows that the Father will carry out his will. And he's not going to evade the cup. He's not going to walk out of the garden. He's not going to abandon the Father's will. And the way that he prepares to drink the cup is through prayer and vigilance and watchfulness and communication with the Father, and depending upon God for strength, and bringing all of this to him, calling him Abba. I mean, we know that that's the intimate term that he uses here to speak to his Father, and asking him, is there a way beyond that? Ellen?
Another thing that is sorrowful to him, that is unknown to him, is the separation that he's going to have with God.
Exactly.
And that is just, it's unknown to him, and it's in a way terrifying.
The separation from God, the alienation from God, I think that's at the heart of the horror for Jesus. He is a man. No human being wants to suffer pain. No human being would look forward to crucifixion. However, we look at some martyrs in the New Testament who go to their death without a word. Peter sleeping the night before he's scheduled to be executed in Acts chapter 12. So we have, Paul saying, hey, I fought the good fight. I finished the course. I've kept the faith. I'm about to be poured out as a drink offering. They're going to kill me. But I see it as being sacrificed on the altar to God without any kind. And here Jesus is saying, if there's a way for this cup to pass. And I do believe it does point to this greater experience that Jesus is having in bearing sin. And then in verse 37, he goes back. And he came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came the third time and said to them, Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It's enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. And the question that kind of came up a moment ago that Ellen sort of raised was, why does he return to the disciples? Why does he go back to the disciples 3 times? You think that's first of all, is that a random number? If it is, it's quite a coincidence that it's 3 times. But why do you think he goes back? Ellen raised the possibility that he may be going back to receive encouragement from them. And it's certainly possible. I would agree that Jesus would love to have found encouragement. The problem with him getting, I think, as I look at that, him getting encouragement from them is they don't understand what's going on. It's impossible for them to give him any encouragement. They're so out of touch with what's happening that they fall asleep. He tells them to watch. They fall asleep. He comes back a second time. He tells them again. And it's like, we've heard this before. They don't know how to answer him. They're just so embarrassed. They're just so put off. They can't even stay awake. What do you think he means when he says the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak? What do you think he is thinking of when he says that?
Alan?
Maybe they were tired. Maybe everybody had more sleep.
It's the middle of the night. I tend to get tired at 2 in the morning, and I might want to really stay up. I mean, there are times I can't stay up for New Year's, and I'd really want to see that ball drop, But 10:30, sorry, I'm getting old. We do the New York time. We celebrate on New York time clock. But yeah, so it could be and it's certainly true, I think very literally, they may want to stay up and watch and kind of be alert and see what's going on, but they're gone. A couple of them have been preparing Passover and everything else, and they're ready to sleep. Any other way it could be taken?
They were just saying, we're going to fight with you to the end. And then they can't even stay awake. How great of warriors are they going to be?
Yeah. He's just talking about
fighting, and they can't even stay awake. Yes, Tim?
This part when Jesus comes back the first time, and you said it kind of softly, I see it a little different. Simon, are you asleep? Could you not stay awake for 1 hour?
Yeah.
I see him a little more.
It's much more.
I see it
louder than either of us agreed.
I think so. Are you asleep?
The big, yeah. And he can't stay awake. Worse trials are coming than being than being a little fatigued. Deanne?
I find it interesting that he calls him Simon instead of Peter. He's not the rock at that point.
Yes.
Yeah, the use of Simon, there may be an indication there. I think sometimes people look at that and say he doesn't call him the rock in that point. He calls him calls him by his Hebrew name, and that may very well be, yeah. And when Jesus comes back and speaks to them about watching and praying that they may not enter into temptation, I think that gives us an idea of the watching, the nature of the watching here. That it's Jesus. Though it would have been wonderful for these men to be able to encourage Jesus because of their spiritual stupor, blindness, hardness, they're in no position whatsoever to help Jesus. And Jesus knows that's where they are. He's told them what's going to happen. He knows what's about to unfold, but he does everything he can to keep coming back and get them to watch and pray. What is Jesus doing? Jesus is watching and praying, and they're not. What's about to happen is Jesus is going to be prepared, and Jesus is going to be ready, and as we well know in the next scene, they are not. In just a moment, they're going to be running. They're going to be gone, and Jesus will be completely forsaken by them. They fail to see that this is that spiritual crisis. This is that moment that is defining them. And Jesus, when he comes back, it's too late. The hour has come. Here it is. There they are. The betrayer's here. You guys are asleep. You know, and it is not. It's not going to go well for them as they fail this crisis. And I know that when we hear flesh and spirit here, this may be a bit of a stretch, but I can't help when I read this but thinking about their spiritual nature and their physical, their fleshly nature. They're so caught up in the flesh that they don't see the bigger spiritual things that are unfolding here, and they sleep through their defining moments. We're going to have to quit. I wish that what I'd like for us to think about, and we probably won't be coming back to this passage, is just how easy it is for us to sleep through our defining moment, to not be ready. If it's a moment of temptation, it's a moment of testing, just to sleep through. We've heard the warnings, we've maybe even know something in our life, and rather than being vigilant, rather than praying, we fall asleep, and we're not ready. I do, if you'll give me just about 60 to 90 seconds, I'd like to end with a little bit of good news that comes out of the garden. And that is that Jesus is essentially watching for his apostles here. Do you see what Jesus leaves his prayer to the Father, where he is pouring out his heart, sorrowful to the point of death, and he gets up from that to go encourage the three to watch and pray. And I believe he's doing that, that because of his concern for them. What does that tell us about Jesus and his concern for us? His concern for us in our weakness, that you know, when we're facing trials, we're not to struggle in isolation. Jesus is there. He's calling us to watch and pray. He is there to encourage us. And in the midst of all of what's going to be their denial and their running, we see, contrary to all that, Jesus and the Father hold so faithfully to their plan, which is to save us. While the followers of Jesus head for the hills, Jesus stands firm, and God is there with him, and Jesus walks toward the cross. You know, as Paul will say, God is there, even in the garden and then at the cross. God is in Christ reconciling the world back to himself, even when the followers of Jesus are scattered. And I think the best news of all in this text is that little piece that the apostles never heard and that we can so easily miss, is when he says, I'll go before you in Galilee after I'm raised. Because that's not just a declaration of Jesus's victory over death. That in and of itself is monumental. But I think we shouldn't miss this. It's also a declaration that they will be reunited with Jesus, that they're going to be reconciled to Jesus after this. just think of how they're going to be feeling when they flee and Jesus goes. That is how it will be to them until they see Jesus raised. And to know that there is a future that isn't just about Jesus being raised, but a future when Jesus will bring them back into fellowship with him. These sheep that have been scattered will be brought back. And to me, that's just good news for all of us because of the times that we fail, that we let Jesus down, that we have run away. And Jesus is, the risen Christ is always ready to receive us back. And anyway, appreciate your comments tonight, and let's close with prayer. Father, as we come before you tonight, we come back to this very familiar story, but it is a story that has truly captured our hearts because it's the story of your love and the story of your Son's love and commitment to us and his willingness to die. Father, we look back at the apostles and we see how hard-hearted they are at times in terms of being able to understand and to grasp what's going on and what Jesus is calling them to. And Father, it's so easy for us to look at them and then fail to see the ways in which we may deny you or follow from afar or run away or fall asleep in a moment when we're being put to the test. Help us not to lose sight of all of these lessons as we think about the apostles. Help us to think about ourselves, and especially to know, because of the resurrection, that there is a way that all of our failures are dealt with through your grace and through the death of Jesus for us. And we thank you for bringing us back into fellowship with you and for making things right that we have made so wrong. And help us, Father, to truly be disciples who are ready not to kill for Jesus and to stand there with a sword in our hands, but truly willing to give up our lives for Jesus, to lay down our lives in service and in ministry and in humility to his glory and yours. We ask you, Father, to bless us with that faith. In Jesus' name.